Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and the Chalice of the Unseen, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. The Chalice That Killed Twice. The moment Father Brown lifted the chalice, he knew. This was not the first time it had killed someone, and it would not be the last. The golden vessel gleamed under the dim candlelight, its intricate engravings catching the flickering glow. But beneath the beauty, something felt disturbingly wrong. The air in the old chapel was thick, oppressive, as if the very walls carried the weight of unspeakable secrets. 2 nights ago, Reverend Samuel Whitmore was found dead at the altar, his hands clutching this very chalice. His lifeless eyes, wide and staring, told a story of terror beyond comprehension. There were no wounds, no struggle, no trace of poison, just the eerie stillness of a man who had seen something he should not have. The authorities were baffled. The doctors had no answers. But Father Brown had seen this before. 30 years ago, in a different village, another priest had died in exactly the same way. Same chalice, same frozen, petrified expression. And back then, just like now, the explanation had eluded everyone. The village was gripped by whispers, hushed conversations in dimly lit corners. At the local pub, old men with shaking hands recounted stories they swore were true, but wished were not. They spoke of curses, of a sacred object tainted by an unholy presence. Some claimed that those who drank from the chalice saw visions, terrible, impossible visions that drove them to madness before their hearts simply stopped. Others whispered about a hidden past, a forgotten sin, buried deep beneath the stones of the church itself. Father Brown listened, his expression unreadable. He was not one to entertain superstition, but something about this case gnawed at him. He had spent his life unraveling mysteries, exposing the sins of men dressed as the work of the supernatural. But this time, even he could not deny the suffocating sense of dread that clung to the air. If this was truly a coincidence, it was the most perfectly designed coincidence he had ever encountered. The first crack in the mystery appeared when he examined Whitmore's personal belongings. Among the priest's effects, there was a journal. The final entry was hastily scrawled, the ink uneven, as if written by a trembling hand. The second time, always the second time. That was all it said. No context, no explanation, just those cryptic words. And Father Brown, for the first time in years, felt a chill run down his spine. Something about that phrase unsettled him. It suggested knowledge, an awareness of something others had missed. Had Whitmore known he was going to die? If so, why had he still taken the chalice? Had he been testing something, proving a point? Or had he been afraid of what would happen if he refused? The deeper Father Brown dug, the more disturbing the truth became. A pattern began to emerge, hidden beneath decades of forgotten records. Every time the chalice had been used in a ceremony, someone had died, but not immediately. It was always the second time. The first use was harmless, an illusion of safety, but the second was fatal. He traced the chalice's history further back, beyond the records, beyond living memory, until he reached something buried in the archives of an old monastery. The chalice had once belonged to a man named Abbot Clement, a 14th-century monk accused of heresy. The records claimed that Clement had been conducting unholy sacraments, rituals disguised as Christian rites but laced with something darker. He had been executed before he could defend himself. But his chalice had disappeared, only to resurface centuries later, passed from church to church, always leaving behind the same inexplicable deaths. Was it possible that something of Clement's forbidden knowledge remained within the chalice, something unseen, undetectable, but devastatingly real? Or was this merely a legend twisted by time, a coincidence that had taken on a life of its own? Father Brown found himself standing before the altar once more, the chalice in his hands. He hesitated. His rational mind told him that this was just a relic, a simple cup made of gold and history. And yet, a whisper of doubt crept into his thoughts. What if the stories were true? What if there was something more to this than reason could explain? Then came the final revelation, the piece of the puzzle that shattered everything. In the monastery archives, beneath the records of Clement's trial, there was a single, almost forgotten note written in the margins by an anonymous monk. It read, "The first drink is a gift. The second is a judgment." Father Brown's grip on the chalice tightened. He looked around the silent chapel, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the stone walls. He thought of Whitmore's last moments, the fear frozen on his face. He thought of the other victims, their unexplained deaths. And for the first time in his life, he did not want to know the answer. The chalice had killed twice. The question was, who would be next? Chapter 2. Father Brown's Deadliest Case begins. The first thing they found was the hand, cold, severed at the wrist, and clutching a silver rosary that had once belonged to a dead man. The second thing they found was the body it should have been attached to. Father Brown stood at the edge of the crime scene, his small figure silhouetted against the fog, rolling over the moors. The body was laid out carefully, reverently, as if arranged by hands that knew the weight of guilt. The victim's throat had been slashed, but the blood around him was all wrong. Too little, too clean. Something about this death was deliberate, not an act of passion, not a crime of convenience. No, this was something darker, something far more ritualistic. The village of Ravenshire had always been quiet, nestled deep within the English countryside. But tonight, the silence was suffocating. The only sound was the occasional gust of wind rattling the chapel's old wooden door. This was not just a murder. This was a message. Father Brown stepped forward, adjusting his round glasses. The detectives on the scene barely acknowledged him. They had learned by now that the small priest often knew more than they did. He knelt beside the corpse, eyes scanning every detail. The dead man's hands were bound. No struggle, no sign of resistance. But it was his eyes that unsettled Father Brown the most. They were wide open, frozen in terror, staring at something he had seen before he died. A shadow moved in the mist beyond the graveyard wall. Someone was watching, someone who did not want this mystery solved. The whispers had started days before the body was found. Locals spoke in hushed voices about the man in the black cloak, a figure seen near the chapel at night, standing beneath the old bell tower. No one knew who he was. No one had seen his face. But now, with a corpse lying in the heart of the village, the fear had become something else, entirely. Father Brown turned away from the body and looked toward the chapel. Something was wrong, something deeper than just a murder. The air felt too still, almost as if something unseen was watching, waiting. Father Brown. A voice called from behind him. It was Inspector Mallory, his usual skepticism laced with unease. "We found this inside the chapel." Mallory handed him a folded note, the paper old and brittle. Father Brown unfolded it carefully, his breath hitching as he read the words scrawled in black ink. "It begins again. You were warned." A chill ran down his spine. This was not the first time this had happened. There was another murder, years ago. The details had been buried, lost in time. A similar scene, a similar note. That case had never been solved. The only thing anyone knew for certain was that the killer had never been caught. Father Brown's mind raced. The way the body was displayed, the missing hand, the deliberate lack of blood, the victim's terrified expression. This was a copycat, or something worse. Then came the most disturbing part. The dead man, Henry Culpeper, had already been buried. 3 weeks ago. Father Brown's heart pounded as the truth settled over him like a shroud. The body in front of him was not fresh. The skin was pale, waxy. The throat was cut post-mortem. Someone had exhumed Henry Culpeper's corpse. Someone had staged this scene, carefully, methodically. But why? Then, a sound, soft, hollow. The chapel bell tolled once. The wind had not moved. The ropes had not shifted. But the sound echoed through the night, sending a ripple of unease through the small gathering of police and onlookers. Father Brown turned, his eyes locking on the bell tower. A figure stood at the top. No face, no features, just a dark silhouette, watching. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Father Brown clenched his jaw. He had solved many mysteries, but this was different. This was the beginning of something far worse than he had ever faced. And he knew without a doubt he might not survive it. Chapter 3. A sacred relic turns deadly. The first time the relic killed, it was called an accident. The second time, it was called a coincidence. But by the third, everyone knew something inside it was alive. Father Brown arrived at St. Winifred's Abbey just before dusk. The bell tower loomed overhead, casting long shadows across the damp cobblestones. The air was thick with something unspoken, something that made even the most devout monks hesitate before stepping inside. The letter that had summoned him was short, urgent, and written in a trembling hand. "It has begun again. Another death. Please come at once. We are afraid." Father Brown pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the abbey was eerily silent. Not the silence of peace, but of fear, the kind that lingers in places where too many prayers have gone unanswered. At the far end of the nave, a small group of monks stood huddled together, whispering among themselves. Their robes were dark, their faces paler than the candlelight flickering against the cold stone walls. One of them turned as Father Brown approached. "Father," the man whispered, his voice hoarse, "it happened again." They led him to the chapel's inner sanctum, where the relic was kept. And there, just beneath the golden altar, lay the body, Brother Matthias. His hands still clutched the relic, a small, ornate cross, its silver surface blackened at the edges as if burned. His eyes were wide, mouth frozen. In a scream he never had the chance to finish. There was no blood, no wounds, nothing to suggest how he had died. But Father Brown had seen this before. "3 deaths," one of the monks whispered. 3 men, all touching the relic, all dying the same way. It must be... He hesitated, then swallowed hard. "A curse." Father Brown knelt beside the body. He reached out, carefully prying the relic from Brother Matthias's rigid fingers. The silver felt ice-cold, despite the warmth of the room. A curse. It was always the same story. Whenever reason failed, whenever fear took hold, the human mind sought out the supernatural. But Father Brown didn't believe in curses. He believed in sin, and sin was always committed by men. "Tell me," he said, his voice calm, "who last held the relic before Matthias?" The monks exchanged uneasy glances. No one wanted to answer, but finally, a young novice spoke. "Brother Thomas," he whispered. "He found Matthias first, but he won't speak to anyone." Father Brown's eyes darkened. "Take me to him." They led him to the cloisters, where Brother Thomas sat alone, rocking slightly, his fingers wrapped around the wooden beads of his rosary. His lips moved in silent prayer, but his eyes never blinked. "Thomas," Father Brown said gently. The monk didn't react. "Brother Thomas," he tried again, stepping closer. This time, the monk's head snapped up. His breath was ragged, his face damp with sweat. "I saw it," he whispered. "I saw him." Father Brown's pulse quickened. "Who?" Brother Thomas's voice dropped even lower, barely audible. "The man who died last time." The words sent a ripple of cold through Father Brown's chest. "Last time?" Brother Thomas nodded, his hands shaking. 5 years ago. A visiting priest. He touched the relic, and the same thing happened. He died, just like Matthias, just like the others. Father Brown's mind raced. Why hadn't anyone mentioned this before? A previous death, a previous warning. Why had they waited until now? Then came the worst part. Brother Thomas leaned in, his breath unsteady. "I saw him, Father. Standing in the nave, watching. He was dead, but he was there." Father Brown said nothing. There was always something terrifying about the mind's ability to twist grief into horror. But was it just fear, or was there something else lurking beneath the surface of this mystery? The only way to know was to go deeper. That night, long after the monastery had fallen into uneasy silence, Father Brown returned to the chapel alone. The relic sat on the altar, untouched since Brother Matthias's death. The candlelight flickered in odd patterns against its silver edges. He reached for it. The moment his fingers brushed the metal, a gust of wind extinguished every candle in the room. Darkness. A whisper. So soft, so distant, he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. "You shouldn't have come." Father Brown turned sharply. The door behind him remained closed. The room was empty. And yet, in the deep shadows beneath the altar, something moved. His breath came slow, steady. He was not a man who feared the unseen. But this felt different. Then he saw it. Just for a second, a figure standing at the very back of the chapel, dressed in the robes of a priest, face pale, eyes unblinking, lips curled into a knowing smile. Father Brown stepped forward. The floor beneath him creaked. The figure didn't move. He reached into his coat, pulling out a match. With a single flick, the flame illuminated the room, and the figure was gone. Only silence remained. But on the altar, where the relic had been, a single word had appeared, burned into the stone. "Confess." Father Brown swallowed. Someone was playing a game. But he was about to play it better, and this time he would win. Chapter 4. The Clue. Hidden in Shadows. The first time Father Brown saw the shadow, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The second time, he knew it was watching. And by the third time, he realized it wasn't just a shadow, it was a message. The village of Dunwich had always been quiet, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But tonight, an unnatural stillness clung to the air, as if the very ground beneath their feet was holding its breath. The old clock tower stood, tall in the center of the square, its hands frozen at exactly 11:06 p.m., the precise moment the body had been found. A young woman, Catherine Holloway, had disappeared 2 nights ago. They had searched the fields, the riverbanks, the abandoned church on the hill. Nothing. Then, just as people began to whisper that she would never be found, her body appeared. Not buried, not hidden, but placed deliberately in the center of the village, beneath the flickering glow of the gas lamps. Her face was turned upward, her expression one of terror. Her hands, clutched against her chest, held something unusual, a scrap of parchment, crumpled and damp from the night air. The ink had bled, but the words remained legible. He watches from the shadows. Father Brown studied the note carefully. The writing was strange, hurried. It looked almost forced, as if whoever had written it hadn't done so by choice. Mallory, standing stiffly beside him, shook his head. Looks like another lunatic with a flair for the dramatic. Father Brown didn't answer. His eyes remained locked on the note. He had seen handwriting like this before, in confessions written by men with trembling hands, men who knew they were about to die. Who had Catherine Holloway been writing to? And more importantly, who had been watching her when she wrote it? He turned back to the body. The way she had been placed, it was methodical, not rushed. Whoever had done this had wanted her to be found, but there was something else, something that made Father Brown's skin prickle with unease. Her shadow. It stretched long and sharp under the glow of the gas lamps, but there was something wrong with it. It didn't quite match the curve of her body. It was as if the shadow had shifted, twisted into something unnatural. Father Brown took a step closer, and then he saw it. In the darkness, beyond the streetlight, where no shadows should have existed, there was another, still watching. He turned sharply, his heartbeat steady but quick. By the time he reached the alleyway, the figure was gone. But something remained. Scratched into the brick wall, almost invisible in the dim light, was a single word: run. The next morning, Father Brown visited Catherine's home. It was a modest cottage on the edge of the village, its windows covered by heavy lace curtains. Inside, the air was stale, undisturbed, a place abandoned in grief. On the writing desk, by the window, there was a notebook. The last few pages had been torn out, but the indentations remained, faint impressions on the paper beneath. Father Brown ran his fingers over them, his mind piecing together the remnants of the message. I saw him. I know him. A cold weight settled in his chest. This wasn't the work of a faceless monster. Catherine knew her killer. But then, why had she written a warning? Something about this case was wrong. Too wrong. Then came the first real revelation, one so unsettling that it sent a ripple of unease through the very foundation of everything Father Brown had thought to be true. The body that had been found in the square wasn't Catherine Holloway. The fingerprints didn't match. The dental records were off. The face, so contorted in terror, was similar, but not identical, which meant Catherine was still out there. Or worse, someone had made her disappear. Father Brown's mind reeled. Who was the woman they had found? Why had she been left with a note written in Catherine's handwriting? And the most terrifying question of all, if Catherine had known her killer, had she become him? That night, as Father Brown sat in the dimly lit chapel, staring at the flickering candlelight, he felt it again. The presence, not just watching, but waiting. The shadows along the stone walls twisted unnaturally, bending where they shouldn't have. A whisper, so soft, so distant, he almost didn't hear it. "You're too late." The candle went out. Darkness. Father Brown stood. He wasn't afraid of the unknown, but this wasn't unknown anymore. This was a warning. The real question was, for whom? Chapter 5. Father Brown knows who lied. The first lie was small, the kind that slips between lips like a whisper, unnoticed, harmless. The second lie was darker. The third was deadly. And by the time Father Brown uncovered the truth, someone else was already dead. It began with a knock at the vicarage door. 3 sharp raps in the dead of night. Outside stood a man drenched in rain, his hands trembling, his breath shallow. "Father Brown," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I think I killed someone." The priest studied the man's face, pale, drawn, haunted by something far worse than guilt. The storm outside howled against the windows, the wind clawing at the trees like unseen hands. But inside, in the warmth of the study, the man shivered, not from cold, but from fear. "Tell me what happened," Father Brown said calmly. The man hesitated, a flicker of hesitation, a shadow across his expression. And then, the first lie. "I don't remember." Father Brown leaned forward. "But you believe you killed someone?" The man nodded, fingers twitching. I woke up with blood on my hands, but I swear I don't remember how." A silence stretched between them, thick, suffocating. Father Brown's eyes didn't waver. "Then whose blood was it?" The man swallowed hard. His mouth opened, closed, and then he said it. The second lie. "I don't know." But he did. And that was the moment Father Brown knew. Someone in the village was already dead. By dawn, the body was found. The village square, quiet in the early morning fog. A figure collapsed beside the fountain, head tilted at an unnatural angle. The damp cobblestones glistened dark red beneath them. Emily Crawford, a well-respected woman known for her sharp wit and sharper tongue. She had made enemies, certainly, but who had hated her enough to kill? Father Brown studied the crime scene. No sign of struggle, no footprints leading away, just a single, bloody handprint on the stone edge of the fountain. A handprint. That did not belong to Emily. Inspector Mallory scowled as he arrived, hands stuffed into his coat pockets. "Well, what do you make of it, Father?" The priest glanced at him. "Someone is lying," Mallory snorted. "Of course they are. That's what criminals do." Father Brown shook his head. "No, this lie is different. This isn't just about avoiding punishment." He paused. "This lie is about hiding something much, much worse." The first suspect was Thomas Reed, the man who had appeared at the vicarage in the night, the man with blood on his hands and fear in his eyes. But the problem was, the blood wasn't Emily's. The forensic report came back by noon. The blood type didn't match, meaning Thomas Reed hadn't killed Emily, meaning there was another body. Somewhere in the village, someone else had already died, and no one had even noticed. Father Brown stood in the churchyard, staring out at the graves, the weight of the truth pressed against his mind like a vice. 2 deaths, he murmured. 1 we can see. 1 we cannot. Mallory frowned beside him. What are you saying? Father Brown turned, his voice quiet but sharp. I'm saying that Emily Crawford wasn't the first to die. Mallory's expression hardened. Then who was? Father Brown exhaled slowly. He already knew, but the truth was worse than he had imagined. The first big reveal came in the form of a letter. A single sheet of paper, slipped beneath the church doors in the dead of night. The ink smudged, hurried, but legible. I saw it happen, but I cannot speak. If I do, I will be next. No name, no signature, just a silent scream pressed into parchment. Father Brown read it twice, and then a third time. His mind worked through the pieces, fitting them together like jagged glass. The missing blood, the hidden body, the handprint, and then the final. Realization struck him like a hammer to the chest. The first victim wasn't missing. They were right in front of him. It happened during the village gathering that night. The townspeople filled the church, whispers of fear swirling like ghosts between the pews. Father Brown stood at the pulpit, his voice calm but firm. There has been a murder, he said, but there has also been a lie. Silence. The first lie was small, he continued. A denial. A convenient forgetfulness. His eyes swept across the room, settling on Thomas Reed. The second was larger. A direct misdirection. Thomas paled, but Father Brown was already turning, already locking eyes with someone else in the crowd. But the third lie was the most dangerous of all. A woman near the back gasped. Someone else muttered nervously. Father Brown inhaled deeply. Because the third lie was not about what happened. He exhaled. It was about who it happened to. A beat of silence. Then, Emily Crawford did not die yesterday. Gasps, murmurs, shock. Father Brown's voice remained steady. She died the night before. Confusion rippled through the crowd, but one person did not react at all. Father Brown turned toward them, eyes unblinking. You knew, he said softly, because you were there. The room froze. The accused took a single step back, a flicker of something cold in their expression. And in that moment, Father Brown knew. They were not afraid because they had already killed twice. The final scene was quiet. A single candle burned in the vicarage. Father Brown sat alone, staring at the flame, his hands folded. A knock at the door. He did not turn. I know who lied, he said. A long pause, and then a voice from the darkness. I know you do. The candle flickered. The door remained closed. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, hiding a truth too terrible to speak. Father Brown closed his eyes and waited. Chapter 6. The murderer's secret is exposed. The first scream came from the church. The second, from the man who thought he got away with murder. And the third, it never came. Because by the time anyone realized what had happened, the killer was already standing in the room. It began with a letter. A single, yellowed page slipped beneath the heavy doors of St. Jude's Chapel, ink smudged from hurried fingers. No signature, no address, just a few chilling words scrawled in uneven handwriting. The body is buried beneath the old pew. Find it before he does. Father Brown read the message twice, his heart hammering against his ribs. The old pew, the very same one where he had sat just last week, offering prayers for a man who now might be lying dead beneath it. The morning light struggled to break through the stained glass, as he entered the empty chapel. Dust particles floated in the still air, caught in the glow of flickering candles. The silence was thick, oppressive, the kind that listened. Father Brown stepped forward, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the heavy stone floor. And then he saw it. A single chair had been knocked over, a candle left burning too long, wax dripping like blood onto the altar. The relic cabinet was slightly ajar. Someone had been here, and they had been looking for something. Slowly, deliberately, he approached the old pew. The air was damp, heavy with something more than just the scent of age. He ran his fingers along the wooden grain, smooth, worn from years of prayer. Then he knelt, and as his hand brushed the floorboards beneath, hollow, his breath caught. Father Brown reached for the edge of the panel, pulling gently, but it didn't move, because it wasn't meant to. It was sealed. His pulse quickened. Whoever had left this letter hadn't just found a body. They had buried one, and whoever had done the burying was still out there. By noon, the police had arrived. The old pew had been ripped from its foundation, the wooden panel beneath it pried open, and inside the shallow grave beneath the church floor, a body, dressed in clerical robes, the fabric torn, stiff with dried blood. The man's eyes, though lifeless, seemed frozen in a look of terror. His fingers clutched at something unseen, as if his final moments had been spent trying to hold on to the truth. Father Brown closed his eyes for just a moment. He had feared this, but what he feared more was the realization that came next. Because this body, this dead priest, was not a stranger. It was Father Gabriel, the very man who had gone missing 2 months ago. Inspector Mallory arrived moments later, his face set in a grim line. "You were right, Brown," he muttered, arms folded. "Someone tried to make sure we never found him." Father Brown exhaled slowly. "And yet, someone else wanted to make sure we did." Mallory frowned. "What do you mean?" Father Brown tapped the folded letter in his pocket. "Someone left me a message. Someone knew exactly where he was buried." Mallory's expression darkened. "So, the question is, did they bury him?" Father Brown shook his head. "No." He glanced back at the open grave. "The question is, why did they wait until now to tell us?" And then, just as he said it, the church bells tolled. The sound was deep, heavy, and wrong, because no one had pulled the rope. The two men locked eyes, and then they ran. The graveyard stretched behind the church, gravestones tilting at uneasy angles, swallowed by creeping ivy. The bell tower loomed above them, casting long shadows against the overcast sky, and standing beneath it, a figure in black, a woman. Her veil hung low over her face, but Father Brown knew who she was before she even spoke. Mallory pulled out his revolver. "Hands where I can see them." The woman did not move. Instead, she lifted her hand and dropped a single, blood-stained rosary to the ground. Father Brown's breath caught, because that rosary belonged to Father Gabriel. And with it, the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. Father Gabriel didn't just die, Father Brown murmured, realization settling over him like a shadow. He was sacrificed. The woman finally spoke. "Do you know why he had to die?" Her voice was almost calm. Mallory tightened his grip on the gun. "Start talking." She tilted her head as if amused. "Because he knew the truth. And truth, Inspector," she stepped forward, "is more dangerous than a lie." And then The first gunshot rang out. Everything happened too fast. The bullet struck the ground inches from where Mallory stood. Chaos erupted, the graveyard filling with the sound of shouting, of feet scrambling over wet earth. The woman ran, and Father Brown ran after her, through the graves, through the crumbling archway of the old cemetery. The wind howled, the trees bending under its force. And then, silence. She had disappeared, vanished into the night. Only the blood-stained rosary remained, glinting in the moonlight. Father Brown bent down, his fingers brushing the beads. And that was when he saw it. A small note, folded carefully between the rosary's links. With shaking fingers, he opened it. The words inside were written in the same ink, the same hurried hand as before. But this time, there was only one sentence. "You are next." Mallory found him minutes later, still kneeling by the note. "We lost her," he muttered, out of breath. Father Brown exhaled, his gaze never leaving the note. "No," he murmured. "We didn't lose her." Mallory frowned. "What do you mean?" Father Brown's hand curled around the rosary. "I mean, she's still watching." And at that moment, the graveyard lanterns flickered out, plunging them into total darkness. The vicarage was quiet that night. Too quiet. Father Brown sat in his chair, staring at the rosary on his desk. The blood had dried. The note lay beside it, its ink stark against the parchment. He reached for it, folded it once, twice, then he turned out the light. From beyond the window, a shadow moved, watching, waiting. Father Brown did not look up. But in the darkness, he whispered, to no one, to everyone, "I know your secret." A pause, then a whisper from the night, "I know yours." The candle flickered. Chapter 7. A sinister force surrounds Father Brown. The first time Father Brown heard the voice, he was alone. The second time, he wasn't. And the third time, it called his name. It began in the dead of night. The vicarage stood silent, shrouded in darkness, save for the dim candlelight flickering inside Father Brown's study. He sat at his desk, deep in thought, his fingers tracing over the edges of a worn, yellowed letter. The letter had arrived without a sender. No signature, no return address. Just a single, cryptic message written in a jagged, hurried scrawl. "Leave now. It is coming." A gust of wind rattled the windows. Outside, the trees twisted in the cold air, their branches scratching against the glass like desperate fingers. Father Brown took a deep breath. He had seen many things in his life. Murder, deception, evil lurking in the hearts of men. But this was different, because this time the fear did not belong to him. It belonged to whoever wrote that letter. By morning, a strange unease had settled over the village. The market square, usually alive with chatter and movement, was subdued, the air thick with unspoken tension. The villagers walked in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the old church at the edge of town. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Something isn't right. I heard footsteps in my house last night, but no one was there. My dog wouldn't stop barking at nothing." And then, the most chilling rumor of all, someone saw a shadow standing outside the vicarage, but when they went to look, it was gone. Father Brown listened to these whispers, his mind working through every possibility. Fear had a way of distorting truth, twisting it into something unrecognizable. But then, the first real sign came. The church bell rang. 3 times. Slow. Hollow. It was a call for the dead. But the problem was, no one had pulled the rope. By the time Father Brown arrived at the church, a small crowd had already gathered, their faces pale in the grey morning light. Inside, the air was thick with incense, the scent heavy and suffocating. The altar candles had been extinguished, and in the center of the aisle, just beneath the bell tower, lay something that shouldn't have been there. A single black veil. Father Brown knelt, his fingers brushing over the delicate lace. It was damp, cold, as if it had been left outside in the rain. But that wasn't what made his breath hitch. No, it was the embroidered name along the edge. Isabella Hartley. Father Brown felt a cold dread settle over him. Isabella Hartley had been dead for 20 years. Mallory arrived minutes later, his usual skepticism replaced by something dangerously close to fear. "Father," he muttered, staring at the veil, "tell me this is just some sick joke." Father Brown's voice was quiet. "If it is, then someone is playing it very well." Mallory exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "All right. We need to talk to someone who knew Isabella. Maybe this is some kind of warning." Father Brown hesitated. He had met Isabella once, years ago, before she disappeared. She had been afraid of something, and then one day, she was gone. Her body was never found, but now, her veil had returned, and it had been placed there for a reason. That night, Father Brown sat in the chapel alone, the veil laid across the altar before him. The wind howled outside, rattling the stained glass windows. Then, the candles flickered, a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible. "Father." He turned sharply, his breath held. The church was empty, but the shadows were not. A movement, just for a second. In the farthest corner of the room, Father Brown's voice was steady. "Who's there?" No answer. Only footsteps. Soft, slow, moving toward him. But then, silence. The air grew colder. Father Brown reached for the crucifix around his neck, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The room was empty again, but the veil was gone. By the next morning, a second letter had arrived. This time, the words were different. "You were warned. Now it is too late." And beneath it, drawn in ink that had smeared as if from shaking hands, the mark of a cross. Mallory stormed into the vicarage, his face twisted in frustration. "All right, Brown. Enough is enough. Someone is trying to scare you off." Father Brown's fingers traced the inked cross on the letter. His voice was distant. "No, Inspector. Someone is trying to confess." Mallory frowned. "Confess to what?" Father Brown looked up, his gaze dark. "To something they did 20 years ago." The final piece fell into place that evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Father Brown stood at Isabella Hartley's old house, the place she had vanished from 2 decades ago. The door creaked open, untouched for years. Dust clung to the air, the scent of forgotten memories, thick and stale. And in the corner of the room, standing against the wall, was a mirror. Tall, ornate, its glass slightly warped with time. But that wasn't what caught Father Brown's attention. It was the fact that there were footprints in the dust leading up to it. And yet, there were none leading away. Father Brown exhaled, stepping forward. His reflection stared back at him, distorted by the old glass. And then, it changed. For the briefest second, his own face wasn't his own. It was hers. Isabella Hartley. Her mouth moved. No sound came. Then, the glass cracked, a single, jagged line splintering across the surface. Father Brown stumbled back, and behind him, a whisper, one that sent ice through his veins. "You found me." He turned, but there was no one there, only her veil, resting on the floor. And beside it, a name, scrawled in dust, one that Father Brown recognized, one that he had trusted, one that had been hiding in plain sight all along. His voice was barely above a whisper. "My God," because now he knew who had killed Isabella Hartley. And worse, he knew they weren't finished. That night, Father Brown sat in his study, the letter and veil resting on the desk before him. He stared at the cracked mirror, now covered with cloth. A knock at the door. He didn't turn. "I know who you are," he said softly. Silence. Then the candle flickered, and from beyond the door, a whisper. "I know you do." The room grew colder, and Father Brown closed his eyes. Chapter 8. The chalice holds a deadly secret. The first man who drank from the chalice died instantly. The second man lived just long enough to whisper the name of his killer. And the third man, he never existed at all. The chalice sat in the center of the altar, untouched for centuries, a relic of the past that should have remained buried. The villagers of St. Augustine spoke of it in hushed whispers, of the strange accidents that followed its presence, of the priests who had tried to remove it and failed. Father Brown had seen many things in his lifetime: murder, deception, the darkness of the human soul. But as he stood before the chalice, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. A warning, a message, not in words, but in the silence that surrounded it. Something was wrong. The first death was dismissed as a tragic accident. Father Daniel Whitmore, a priest who had come to St. Augustine's only 6 months earlier, had been found dead inside the church, his hands still gripping the chalice as if he had been trying to lift it. His face was frozen in an expression of terror. His lips parted as though his final breath had been stolen from him. There were no wounds, no poison, no signs of struggle. The coroner's report was inconclusive. The official cause of death? Unknown. But the villagers knew better. "This chalice is cursed," an old woman muttered. "No priest should touch it twice." It was nonsense, of course. Father Brown didn't believe in curses. But when the second priest died, he started to wonder if the truth was even worse. The second death came only a week later. This time, it was Brother Edward, an older man, wise beyond his years, known for his deep knowledge of ancient texts and forgotten relics. He had been studying the chalice, writing about its origins, when he collapsed in the monastery library. He didn't die immediately. He had just enough time to say one thing, one name, a name that didn't exist. The monks who had gathered around him swore that his last word was Gabriel, but no one in the village, no one in the monastery, no one who had ever even touched the chalice had that name. Father Brown frowned at the reports. Something didn't make sense. He flipped through Brother Edward's notes, searching for anything that might connect the chalice to someone named Gabriel. And then, buried deep in the records, he found it. A single entry. A name scratched into the margins of an ancient manuscript. Gabriel Whitmore. The name should have meant nothing. But Father Brown's hands tightened around the page, because Whitmore wasn't just any name. It was the same name as the first priest who had died, and Gabriel Whitmore had been dead for over a century. The pieces were starting to form a picture. The chalice had belonged to a priest named Gabriel Whitmore, a man who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His last known act was a final sermon, one that, according to legend, ended with him collapsing at the altar, clutching the very same chalice. His body had never been found. Father Brown sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. If these deaths were coincidences, they were the strangest he had ever encountered. If they weren't, then someone had kept this secret buried for a very long time. That night, he stayed in the monastery library long after the others had gone to bed. The candlelight flickered as he traced his fingers over the text. Gabriel Whitmore had been a scholar, a man obsessed with something called the blood of the chalice. No record explained what it meant. No text described what had happened to him. It was as if he had been erased. Father Brown stood and crossed the room to the relic chamber. The chalice sat there, waiting. He hesitated only for a moment before reaching for it. The metal was cold, too cold. The kind of cold that seeps into the bones. And as his fingers brushed the surface, a sound filled the air. A whisper, faint, indistinct, but unmistakable. A voice. He turned sharply, but the room was empty. Yet the whisper remained. Father Brown knew fear when he felt it, but this was different. This was something else. A presence. A warning. He placed the chalice back down, stepping away, his pulse steady but quick. He had his answer. The chalice did not belong to the living. The next morning, he confronted the monks. Someone knew the truth. Someone had kept this secret hidden. And finally, after a long silence, the oldest among them spoke. "We were told never to speak of it," he whispered. "But you are right, Father. Gabriel Whitmore did not die at the altar." Father Brown waited. They buried him beneath it. A chill passed through him. The altar, the very place where the chalice now sat. He moved without another word, pushing past the monks, entering the chapel, his eyes fixed on the stone floor. And there, etched into the foundation, barely visible beneath the dust of centuries, were the words, "Let no one drink again." The monks arrived moments later, watching as Father Brown pressed his hands against the stone. It was loose, movable, a cover for something beneath. And when they lifted it, darkness, a hollow chamber, untouched for 100 years. And in the center, resting on decayed cloth, lay the skeletal remains of a man still dressed in priestly robes. Gabriel Whitmore had never disappeared. He had been hidden, sealed away beneath the very chalice he had died protecting. And clutched in his skeletal fingers was a second chalice, identical to the first. Father Brown's breath caught two chalices, one that had been displayed, one that had been buried, the real one. He looked up at the monks, realization dawning. Someone had replaced the chalice, switched them, which meant the one on the altar was a warning, a trick designed to keep people away from the real secret. And yet 3 men had died, not from poison, not from any curse, but because they had touched what should never have been found. Father Brown lowered himself into the chamber, his hands trembling as he reached for the real chalice. The bones crumbled at his touch, and as he lifted it into the light, the whisper returned. This time, it was clear. "You should have left it buried." The candles in the church flickered, and then one by one, they went out. The monks gasped. One of them crossed himself. But Father Brown did not move. He simply stared down at the chalice, the weight of it pressing against his palms, a relic of the past, a secret that had killed men. And now, a question that could never be answered. What had Gabriel Whitmore tried to protect, and why did the dead still guard it? Father Brown placed the chalice back in its resting place. He looked up at the watching monks. His voice was quiet but firm. This should remain where it is. They nodded, and together they sealed the chamber once more. The truth, the real truth, would remain hidden. Some mysteries, Father Brown thought, were not meant to be solved. That night, as he walked back to the vicarage, he felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him. Not malicious, not vengeful, just watching, waiting. The chalice held a deadly secret, and now, so did he. Chapter 9. A missing priest, a dark omen. The last time anyone saw Father Michael, he was standing at the church's threshold, staring into the night, as if something was calling his name. The next morning, his robes were found neatly folded on the altar, but Father Michael was gone, and the only thing left behind was a single bloody handprint on the chapel door. The villagers whispered of curses, of dark omens that had plagued the church for centuries. No priest had ever stayed in St. Luke's for long. Each one either vanished, went mad, or died in ways that no one could explain. And now, with Father Michael's disappearance, fear was beginning to take hold. Father Brown arrived at the church just as the sun was setting, casting long, twisting shadows through the stained glass windows. The air was thick, heavy, with an unnatural stillness. The pews sat empty. The candles flickered weakly, as if struggling to stay alight. He ran his fingers over the blood-stained handprint on the door. The shape of it was strange, smudged, almost dragged, as if Father Michael had tried to hold on to something before being pulled away. Inspector Mallory stood behind him, arms crossed. No forced entry, no struggle, no sign of where he went, he muttered. It's as if he just vanished. Father Brown turned, his eyes dark with thought. No one just disappears, Inspector, he said. Not without a reason. Mallory sighed. Then tell me, Father, what was the reason? Father Brown didn't answer. Not yet, because he was beginning to suspect that this wasn't the first time this had happened. The church archives were old, untouched for years, the pages brittle beneath Father Brown's fingertips. He traced the names of the priests who had served at St. Luke's over the past century. One by one, he read their fates. Father Damien, missing. Father Joseph, died under mysterious circumstances. Father Ignatius, found dead, cause unknown. And now, Father Michael, vanished without a trace. 4 priests, 4 disappearances, and the strangest part, each of them had vanished on the exact same date. The whispers of the villagers returned to his mind. The church was cursed. No priest ever stayed. They either fled, lost their minds, or something took them. Mallory frowned as he read over Father Brown's shoulder. You don't actually believe this nonsense, do you? Father Brown closed the book softly. I don't believe in curses, Inspector, he murmured, but I do believe in patterns. And this pattern was leading him somewhere he did not want to go. That night, Father Brown sat alone in the chapel, the only light coming from a single candle, flickering near the altar. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. But as the wind howled through the broken stained glass, something shifted in the darkness, a whisper, so soft it could have been the wind, or something else. Father Brown stood slowly, his gaze sweeping across the empty pews. He wasn't alone. A shadow moved near the confessional. He took a step forward. Father Michael, he called out. Silence. And then, a breath, Not his own. It came from inside the confessional. Father Brown swallowed, his heartbeat steady but quick. He reached for the wooden door, the handle ice-cold beneath his fingers. He pulled it open. The booth was empty, except for a single scrap of paper resting on the wooden bench. He picked it up, unfolding it carefully. The ink was smudged, hurried, as if written in a desperate rush. 3 words. Do not follow. A gust of wind slammed the confessional door shut. The candle on the altar flickered violently, then went out. Darkness swallowed the church whole. The next morning, the villagers found Father Brown sitting in the front pew, staring at the altar. He had not slept. He had not spoken a word. But when he finally turned to them, his voice was quiet, distant. I know where he went. Mallory arrived minutes later. Tell me you have something. Father Brown held up the note. Do not follow. Mallory scowled. That's not much of a clue. Father Brown's gaze didn't waver. It's not a clue, he murmured. It's a warning. Mallory hesitated. A warning against what? Father Brown exhaled slowly. Against what's waiting for us if we find him. The church graveyard stretched behind them, the tombstones cracked and crumbling with time. But Father Brown's eyes weren't on the graves. They were on the mausoleum. Its stone doors were slightly ajar, as if someone had entered recently, or worse, as if something had come out. Mallory pulled his gun as they stepped inside. The air was damp, thick with the scent of earth and decay. The light from their lanterns flickered weakly against the stone walls. And then, in the farthest corner of the crypt, they found him. Father Michael knelt before a ruined altar, his head bowed, his robes covered in dust. His lips moved in silent prayer, but his eyes were wide, terrified. Father Brown approached carefully. Father Michael. The priest didn't move. Mallory exhaled. He's alive. Father Brown knelt beside him. Michael, he said gently. What happened? The young priest's lips trembled. I heard it, he whispered. I heard it calling me. Father Brown's breath caught. What did you hear? Michael's hands gripped the stone beneath him. The voice, he murmured. The one that's been here long before us. Mallory frowned. What is he talking about? Father Brown's voice was barely above a whisper. Something that should never have been woken up. Mallory shook his head. This is ridiculous. He's in shock. But Father Brown wasn't listening. He was staring at the altar behind Michael, at the symbol carved into the stone. A symbol he had seen before. A symbol that had been scratched into the walls of St. Luke's for over 100 years. A mark of something older than the church itself. A mark of something waiting to be found. Michael turned to them, his eyes hollow. We were never alone in this church, he whispered. They've always been watching. Mallory cursed under his breath, stepping back. That's enough. But before he could finish, the church bell rang. Not from the bell tower. From beneath the ground. Father Brown's breath hitched. Michael's face paled, and in the darkness of the crypt, the shadows began to move. The next morning, Father Brown stood at the altar. The villagers gathered before him, their eyes filled with fear. They had found Father Michael. They had brought him home. But something had followed them back. Father Brown's hands tightened around the edges of his robe. He had solved many mysteries. He had seen the worst of humanity. But this was something else. Something that was not yet finished. As the villagers left, Mallory turned to him. What now? Father Brown's voice was calm. "We wait," he murmured. Mallory frowned. "For what?" Father Brown looked past him, toward the open church doors. "For whoever is next." Chapter 10. The truth that must stay buried. The body was supposed to be 6 feet under, but when they dug up the grave, it was empty, and in its place, lying in the damp earth, was something that never should have been found. A second coffin, and inside it, someone was still breathing. The discovery sent a ripple of unease through the village. Father Brown stood at the edge of the open grave, the lantern light flickering against the disturbed soil. Inspector Mallory, usually quick to dismiss superstition, was silent for the first time in his career. No one spoke. No one moved. Then the coffin creaked. A breath, a whisper, and then a hand slammed against the inside. Father Brown exhaled, stepping forward as Mallory drew his revolver. The gravediggers hesitated, then moved closer, prying open the lid. The hinges groaned, resisting, as if the wood itself was trying to keep its secret buried. And there, beneath the coffin's lid, a face stared back at them. But it wasn't the face of the man they had buried. It was someone else. Someone who was supposed to be dead. The whispers spread like wildfire through the village. The body that had been laid to rest in that grave was gone. But no one could explain how or why. The coffin had been nailed shut. The grave is undisturbed. Yet here they were, and now someone had taken his place. Mallory leaned over the coffin, his face pale. "This is impossible." Father Brown didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the man lying in the casket, his breath shallow, his lips moving as though trapped in a nightmare. Then finally, he spoke, and what he said changed everything. "They never let me leave." The words came slowly, hoarse and broken. The man in the coffin barely had the strength to whisper, his eyes wide with a terror that did not belong to the living. Father Brown knelt beside him. "Who?" The man swallowed. His gaze darted toward the church, toward the shadows that stretched across the graveyard. The ones still down there. The silence was suffocating. No one breathed. No one spoke. Then the church bell rang. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. The exact number of knocks the villagers had heard on the church door the night before the funeral. The exact number of times the missing man had whispered his final words. 3 knocks, 3 rings, and now 3 bodies unaccounted for. The village of Blackwater had always carried whispers of its past, of a history too dark to be remembered. The church records were incomplete, dates missing, entire pages torn out. No one questioned it. Until now. Father Brown spent the next hours searching the church archives, dust settling in the candlelight as he flipped through pages that had not been read in a century. And then he found it, buried in the back of an old ledger, a list of names, each one crossed out, each one marked with the same date, and at the bottom of the list, the words, "We must never tell." Father Brown closed the book slowly, because now he understood. The man in the coffin wasn't supposed to be found. He was supposed to be buried. The storm came that night. Rain lashed against the stained glass windows, wind howling through the empty streets. The villagers had locked their doors. No one dared step outside, but in the church, Father Brown sat alone, waiting for whatever was coming. Next, the candle beside him flickered, the flame dancing wildly before it snuffed out completely. The room plunged into darkness. And then, a knock at the door, once, twice, 3 times. Father Brown exhaled. He did not move. He did not need to, because he already knew who was standing on the other side. The dead do not knock, but secrets do. Mallory arrived minutes later, his coat dripping from the rain. "The man from the grave," he said breathlessly. "He's gone." Father Brown's expression didn't change. "Of course he is." Mallory hesitated. "He left something behind." He handed Father Brown a folded piece of paper. Inside, scrawled in shaky ink, were 3 words. "Don't dig deeper." Father Brown stared at the words, his grip tightening. The ink was still wet. Mallory crossed his arms. "We need to find him." Father Brown shook his head. "We need to find the truth." And that was the moment the church bell rang again. This time from beneath their feet. By morning, the villagers gathered outside the chapel. The storm had passed, but the unease remained. Father Brown and Mallory stood before the oldest part of the church, the catacombs, the place where the village's oldest secrets had been buried, the place where the missing man had begged them not to go. Mallory gritted his teeth. "I hate this." Father Brown said nothing. He simply took the lantern and stepped inside. The walls were damp, the air thick with decay. Rows of stone coffins lined the tunnels, each one older than the village itself. Dust coated every surface. It had been centuries since anyone had set foot here, and yet the footprints in the dirt told a different story. Someone had been down here recently. Father Brown followed the prints, the flickering lantern casting long shadows against the stone. And then, at the very end of the tunnel, he saw it, a sealed door, marked with the same symbol from the ledger, the one that meant, "Do not open." Mallory exhaled. "We're opening it, aren't we?" Father Brown nodded. The door groaned as it gave way. The smell of earth and dust poured out like a breath long held, and inside, rows of coffins. But these were different, because every single one had been chained shut. Mallory's face paled. "This isn't a burial site." Father Brown stepped forward. His fingers traced the chains, rusted, old, but still intact, still locked. And then he saw the inscription carved into the lid of the nearest coffin, the name of the missing man, the man they had just pulled out of the grave. Mallory whispered, "What does this mean?" Father Brown's voice was barely above a breath. "It means," he swallowed, "we buried the wrong man." And as the words left his lips, the chains began to rattle. The lantern flickered, and somewhere, in the silence of the catacombs, a whisper rose, soft, hollow, and impossibly close. "You shouldn't have come." Father Brown turned sharply, but the tunnel behind them was empty. Mallory cursed. "We need to go." But Father Brown's eyes remained locked on the coffin, because now he knew the truth, and it was never supposed to be found. Some secrets belong to the dead, and some truths must stay buried.